Okay, we're running Linux. Right, thank you very much, Chris. We transitioned reasonably usefully from CNCF into the broad scope of where open source is sitting for us all, and that's this. There we go, wonderful. Okay, there is one active. So, hello, I'm Andy from Control Plane, founder and CEO. I'm an open source security guy. We have, at Control Plane, been invested into open source, CNCF, since day zero, and I'm also one of the co-chairs, also the end of my tenure in tag security, where we are threat modeling and assessing software as it climbs the CNCF ladder, works towards graduation. Some of the things we've been doing there, we've worked on Flux. The Black Car project is super interesting because threat modeling an operating system, that's a real scoping issue. We're currently working on Kubeflow, which again, so many different moving parts, maintaining that scope, making sure we deliver value in a community-driven way, bring everyone along the journey. It's imperative, fantastically interesting. And I also work as the CISO for Open UK. So Open UK is a charity focused on open hardware, open source, open data, and we do government advisory. We interact with international governments to try and avoid open source foot guns getting into law and that kind of thing, and then various other things. I'm very heavily invested in the space. So we'll talk about the essence of open source code today. How that sits versus source available, what these license transitions are doing to us as a community, as contributors and as consumers, and work through some of the threats and potential solutions to these problems. Again, as a security guy, this is from a threat modeling perspective, so trying to get into the essence of the thing and then expound on potential fixes. So, a little bit about who I am. I love open source. I've been doing stuff and just putting it out there for free since the beginning of my career because I couldn't believe that people giving away all of this information. Back when I was just out of university, I discovered OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, and I would drive from one side of the UK to the other to go to these meetups, and they gave me a thick book full at the back of printed out XSS strings, Unicode attacks. Didn't believe information and security details were being given away for free, and that really fundamentally set my ideology and vision for how things have transpired, and that is baked into the essence of what we do at Control Plane as well. So these are some of the things that we have either thrown out into the commons or actually monetized in some way. There's my original Kubernetes contribution, docs fix XCD in 2015. It's worth saying that I'm a reasonably dangerous programmer. I can prototype things very well, but I've committed crimes against software development in various different forms. So most of these things prototyped, some value derived or formed because people were using them, and then they've been rewritten by my far more talented colleagues. So just because we're talking about open source sustainability, we'll start off by dog fooding essentially. KubeSec was the first static analysis tool for security context. We were shipping Docker 0.8 systems. Kubernetes was obviously the future when it landed, but there was very little static analysis. So for that tool, we just gave it out, open source. There is a hosted version which costs us very little. And as a consultancy, this just helps to build our reputation and it brought us work. Same with Netaserv. It's basically an Nmap worm that replicates itself through a network topology to test firewall rules and network policies. It jumps into network namespaces, so it's context aware for network policies in Kubernetes. Again, that's now been rewritten. We install that with customers, it's all free. Bad Robot, same thing, static analysis for RBAC. It's in some pipelines for massive companies around the world, but you know, it's a security and static analysis tool. It's reasonably commoditizable. There's not a lot of value to capture there, but it does bring us that reflective recommendation, reputation. Simulator is a CTF platform. So we run the CTF KubeCon with this. It's all open source, but we have a hosted version where we actually capture value that way. So we make good money off that. And then finally, FluxCD, which is an open source GitOps tool. We now sponsor an enterprise distribution of this where we package up and CVE fix, as well as FIPS for 40 hardened SSL, and we sell access to immediate patching because it's a 3-day release training project, it's all open source. So we'll investigate how this sits in the landscape that we're seeing now with everything from the XZ, the HashiCorp, the Redis pieces as we progress through. And of course, if you pay for software that you love, a lot of these problems get a little bit easier. So there's lots of ways to do that from Open Collective through GitHub and Patreon and all those good things. So what on earth is open source? What we're talking about here, it is the foundation of modern technology. It's been adopted by everything from banks, it runs on fighter jets and spacecraft, it is proliferated everywhere, and it's essentially one. We care about it, especially today, because it underpins our careers, it underpins what we do on a day-to-day basis. Kubernetes, Run C, Linux kernel, end-to-end, visible source that we can patch, modify, contribute back, and use to make money from it. Be that as part of a bigger system, be that selling services around it, be it packaging and redistributing it in our own way. And open source has a very strong and defined definition. And that is courtesy of the Open Source Initiative. Huge congratulations to Chris, who has been elected onto the board of directors for OSI and brings hopefully some positive innovation into this space where we're seeing a lot of new licenses that do not fit the OSI definition. We'll break down why that is exactly. So open source is enshrined by the OSI and very clearly defines what open source is. And it gives its stamp of approval to licenses that comply with it. So notably, there are restrictions in some of these newer licenses that don't fit within the definition properly, and that is specifically around restricting network usage in order to try and extract money value from hyperscale cloud providers who are hosting these products. So open source requires us to be able to see the source code, to be able to distribute it, modify it ourselves. It's free as in freedom, there are no restrictions on its use, and most importantly, it's free as in beer. So you don't have to pay for it. It's also essential to understand what open source and definition does not cover. And that includes things like trademarks, specific support mechanisms. This is where the rubber hits the road. This is where money and finance, which are what are used to pay poor open source developers, as otherwise they walk on the streets barefoot. When something becomes popular or critical, then the pressure on the maintainers gets that much higher. The importance of supporting them and ensuring the project is not potentially open to undue influence from another angle. Again, we look at where that is from a security or from a financial perspective. And it's where we're seeing friction. Open source projects are now being attacked by potentially nation states. It's difficult to attribute exactly who has been, for example, jumping in on the ZX repo, because we know from things like Snowden leaks that tradecraft from nation states is designed to distract and not give you a clear chain of attribution. We don't know where that individual came from. What we do know is that they dropped a backdoor into a library that was used by SSH under certain conditions through systemd. And I know from my perspective, as a security guy, if I just backdoored SSH everywhere, I wouldn't burn that exploit on a public-facing, internet-facing socket on an internet-facing SSH server. I'd try and escalate my privilege deeper within somebody else's network, somewhere I'd already established a foothold into something that was perimeterized. So, pretty serious things going on here that potentially impact, I don't want to say geopolitical outcomes, but we're in a space where it's difficult to predict exactly what order of magnitude the seriousness of that breach would have got to. Now, the fact that it is in open source gives us many eyes on it. It means that this was discovered, it was detected and patched before it proliferated, which, if this was a closed source binary, if this was something that would require reverse engineering to even start to understand the code parts, it's unlikely that we would have got to this point. So Open source still continues to prove its value from a security perspective as well as an economic one. So, from an economic perspective then, what is an OSS? The trademarks that we have around a piece of software. These are really important because they give maintainers something to own when the code is in the commons. Support and responding to bug reports, nothing to do with open source software, hosting a PaaS or a SaaS, and OSS does not prescribe any governance. When we clearly see how much this matters, this is what neutral foundations like Linux Foundation, CNCF, Apache, Eclipse, they achieve this for us. And it's not just the trademark, it's also the distribution channels. For many people, Postgres is what you get from Postgres.org. So the open source quandaries today, how do we get paid? How and why do we get forked? Monetization, competition, maintaining project relevance as the tech landscape continues to evolve at pace in front of us. Live Nebraska called it. This is the de facto slide to put into any supply chain security or open source sustainability talk. That Live Nebraska, there is actually a person who is doing that for one of the open source critical infrastructure projects for the internet. And look at what our once beloved HashiCorp has recently become entangled. The creator of development tools for developers, by developers, so much goodwill, so much mindshare, and look what they've become. Changing licenses is permissible, but it has social and ideological effects. Posting hostile legal threats to the entirely free and correct open source OpenTofu fork reminds us once more that open source is not a business model, and projects need to capture value, but in some cases, projects think they can capture a lot more value than either the market or we as consumers believe that they should. HashiCorp has an extremely high valuation, but they're still making these plays and practices to try and extract as much value as possible, and the current leadership of that organization are a long way divorced from people that we know and love who built those foundational tools back in the day, starting with Vagrant and going through Vault and Terraform in its own time. So there's not always realistic expectations when large finance is involved in these organizations or projects. So, in the search for sustainability for open source software, we have to recognize that the open source itself is not the business model. We've seen a new form of license emerge to try and capture these things, one that prevents the use of software in specific fields of endeavor. This is the server-side public license, the business-side license, the BSL. That is, when we're providing software over a network, a different set of restrictions kick in. And this is specifically not OSI compatible. The OSI license demands non-discriminatory, free and open use of the software, among many other things. So these two licenses specifically are excluded. In some ways, we can understand. In some ways, we can understand why that is, because as creators, as developers, we want to capture value. We've created something, we believe that we should be remunerated for it. But this desire to kill all free riders and capture everything is antithetical to the definitions of open source that we live by, that the industry has captured this value from, because of this warranty-free, unsuable litigation perspective that the licenses give us. So open source is a production model, it is not a business model. And let's have a look at some of the models around open source that we can use as business models, get that sustainability, give our projects the health they need to exist in perpetuity, and see how we can do those things. So best practice open source contribution involves patching back, involves contributing back what we've modified. Now, some licenses mandate this, others don't, but essentially, it's good faith. And when we look at the hyperscalers who are hosting some of these projects, they do a hell of a lot of work patching and contributing back, hiring core maintainers to sponsor projects indirectly. So there is definitely a balance here that's not clearly delineated as you might have heard. And of course, the reason we've seen so much success in open source is because it saves costs. And again, looking at the consumer versus delivery side value of open source, it's an incredible amount of money, and it makes perfect sense that in a capitalist economy, we optimize for efficiency and creating value and saving money. So open source is one from that perspective, but it's not always been this way, and the balance between closed and open source maybe still has some relevance in place in today's age. So when we're talking about these hyperscalers, the big clouds running at all these data centers and very high revenue rates, they're able to host open source software at economies of scale. And those economies of scale are unrivaled even by well-capitalized VCs. These are some of the biggest companies in the world, and it's impossible to compete with them. They found their place in the market, they've captured value, they provided a highly effective and efficient service that now underpins almost all technology deployments. Now, the way that they're doing this is defined and committed by the open source licenses that they're hosting. Protected strongly by the definition, but for some business models built around open source software, this competition drastically limits the potential growth of the project, the organization supporting the software, but due to the hyper-converged nature of the service offering, it's unlikely that we will be able to compete anyway, because they're providing something that's so much more effective, so much more efficient. And so, what else can we do? What makes sense around this? And this is also where multiple competing offerings make sense. If you look at something like WordPress, well, the classic old open source technologies, there's many different places that you can run WordPress. It's free to host, and that competition brings innovation. And it's these are market forces and economies. They make sense, and they've worked, and that's a good and effective use of the open source license. Now, many VC and commercial open source folks want to be able to keep using open source, but also to be able to maintain a monopoly. That's essentially what these license changes are looking to do. So they focus on the obvious bad guys, in this case the hyperscalers, and construct a narrative where they're preventing unfair competition, in inverted commas. But they're actually preventing any kind of competition in a specific form and looking to form a monopoly with these licenses. So the framing of this, when you look at it, is actually not only a value capture, but a new monopoly, which is again antithetical to the core open source licenses. Redis has recently undergone this form as well, and Tyrus, the guy who built the whole thing, very vocal on Hacker News, said he wanted to have Redis under a BSD license so he could fork it in the future and not be beholden by another organization trying to capture value. So he put it under a BSD license so he could fork his own software and do as he wanted with it, with impunity in the future, which is very much the essence and the heart and soul of open source itself. Okay, so we're going to start a new project from scratch. How do we actually do this in a useful, sustainable, and financially managed way? What can you do to protect your brand new open source repository, built it in private, or shared it with a small group of people, and it's now ready to open source? Your ambition is to be the next big thing. How do you protect yourself? Well, the first phase, the trademark registration. This gives you legal ownership of the name, but not the source code. It's in the commons, of course. And after that, your domain name, socials, whatever else you need for marketing purposes, you can add sponsorship buttons. And if you're a social kind of person, you can live stream your progress, building up a community interest. Your software overnight becomes incredibly successful. Your adoption stars go through the roof, people start paying for access to support, adding new features, and you can suddenly build a hosted product on top of this as well. What else can you do? Well, it turns out, potentially not a lot. If you get rehosted by a hyperscaler, then they hit Keynote and are running your software. This is one of the rarest cases to happen to open source. And realistically, if this has happened to you, you've got an incredibly successful product. Your project is definitely being used in a lot of places for a hyperscaler to bother to rehost it because they then have to put the investment in to get the thing running. And if you haven't found a way to monetize your project by that point, it probably doesn't matter that they've rehosted it for you. So there's an interesting inflection point here, and really there's, whether it's 1 in a million, 1 in hundreds of thousands, very few projects achieve this badge of honor. So how do you keep on making money, be so valuable that they can't ignore you? The Cal Newportism. There's marketplace integration. You can work with these providers, but just consider the different quantum that they exist at, and actually what people who consume your products want. They want a convenient service delivered in a way to consume it, probably at the expense of having to build and maintain the infrastructure to run the software themselves. So, in order to be in a good place here, we need to think about the open source business model. There's multiple different ways we can do that. Have a look at them in a moment. The best money, of course, is customer money. The trade-off is growth. Do we take VC investment, or do we organically try and build this project up from nothing? Sales and marketing, again, they're either J-curve, VC-based mass investments, heavily funded, but there's no right answer here. The choices are yours based on options and side effects. And as a side note, small teams are often able to do things better. Agility in the GOAT sense rather than the capital A. Commercial stage teams potentially risk esoteric features and requests that are driven from outside the core engineering team. In the service model, organically grown, funded from gross profits, you hire as many people as you can afford, regulated by the adoption and financial benefit that you receive from the project. This is sustainability without runway, cliff edge. Again, they are diametrically opposed both ideologically and in implementation. There is no right answer, but we can see that there is more generally investment financially from VCs than there are from the organic piece. So let's have a look at some threat modeling. This is how we identify bad things and figure out how we would fix them. The first thing to note, the trend from open source to source available means community are looking for 4 things whenever we get to a trigger point here. We have the code itself. If we've got something that's too simple, then there's no value to capture. If it's too complex, it's very difficult to have contribution. And otherwise, if it's just too easy to host, then it will be hosted elsewhere, and there's no value in there inherently. Maintainers are incredibly difficult to attract and maintain. We need open governance, we need a way for them to iterate quickly, to be onboarded, to understand the test suite, to be able to deploy these things themselves, and of course hostile contributions from, as we've seen, the wider internet. The IP itself, if consumers or maintainers disagree, then we risk just being forked and having the thing out there in the open. Patent trolling itself is another risk that is very difficult to do anything about. We've seen that again with HashiCorp, OpenTofu and Valkyrie in this space, and of course the financial aspects. Realistically, this is the most difficult part. Money is not easily gained, and in many cases it's easier to take the VC funding. We have issues with, again, copyright claims in here, and new legislation, in the case of AI potentially, and the adoption both of open source and the hyperscalers. I realise I'm verging on time here, so I'm going to whip through the last few. We've got numerous different business models, from donations and crowdfunding through adding support, freemium tiers, open core, subscription services around these things, bundling stuff up with consumer hardware, and at the top end, enterprise support subscriptions to add value for customers with difficult requirements of regulation, dual license, productization, and bits of hosted solutions. And of course, we all see regarding cloud services. We have source unavailable or available for non-OSI models. The wonderful definition of this as open source is a usage of the term. And finally, whizzing through open source from scratch, you can either start with an open source license, or you can use an innovative license, or do the bait and switch that we've seen, which will destroy consumer and contributor trust, precipitate a fork, and probably destroy any confidence in the future sustainability of the project. So, fundamentally, deciding on your business model early on in the lifecycle of the project, and whether or not you want to actually support all use cases and feature requests that come in an open source way, or maybe shut that down and just do things in a proprietary manner. These things will define whether or not you manage to sustainably keep the project going. And of course, foundations give confidence to consumers that you're actually doing something. Longevity and governance exists in a positive sense. Control plane do this with KCD. We provide enterprise support while just patching back and supporting the core projects. With 2 maintainers just work full-time there, and we distribute just a hardened and CD patched container image along with all the signatures that go with that. That is the upsell and value add for what is already a well-deployed and widely deployed project. Thanks to Weaveworks, it's a real sponsor. And with that, thank you for your attention and have a wonderful rest.